Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got quite a bit of material here. It's excerpts from a Fox News YouTube segment. Looks like it was uploaded May 2025. And it takes a very specific angle on U.S. politics right now.
Right. And our job in this deep dive really is just to pull out the key claims, the criticisms, the narratives from these sources.
Exactly. We want to give you a clear picture of the specific viewpoint they offer, on the Biden administration, the Democratic Party, the media based purely on what's in this material.
Yeah, we're basically stepping into the perspective of this source. We're not here to agree or disagree, just to map out what it says.
And it definitely presents a strong perspective, uses some pretty vivid language, specific examples.
It does. So we'll just walk you through what it actually says.
Okay, so where it gets really interesting, I think, is right at the start. The source material just jumps straight into some pretty heavy accusations about the current administration, specifically about President Biden.
The central claim, the core assertion presented, is one of cognitive decline.
Yeah, using some very pointed language like Smokin' Joe's keeping the hooks alive, and even the idea of a brain-dead president.
And the source doesn't just frame this as, a health issue. It frames it as a major alleged cover-up.
Cover-up.
It's a claim of a significant effort by Biden's team, and importantly, they say, by the media, to hide this supposed decline from everyone.
Wow. And to sort of emphasize how serious they see this alleged deception, they make a pretty dramatic comparison.
They do. They claim this situation is actually worse than Watergate.
Worse than Watergate? How do they justify that?
Well, the contrast the source draws is that, in their view, Richard Nixon, even when he was drinking, was still basically in control of his faculties.
Ah, okay. So the implication is that this alleged cover-up involves something more fundamental, like an inability to govern.
That seems to be the argument presented, yes.
Yeah.
And a big part of their case, or the source's case, leans on what it calls bombshell revelations.
From where?
From a book, apparently by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson. And according to the source's reading of this book, it claims White House staff acted undemocratically. And the reason given, because of their, quote, hatred for President Trump.
So the source is saying that hatred was the motive for hiding Biden's condition.
That's the connection the source makes, yeah. And it gets quite specific about who they claim was actually running things.
Oh.
It asserts that unelected people were in charge, specifically points to aides around Jill and Hunter Biden.
Describing them how?
As, unelected, not Senate confirmed, but essentially running the show behind the scenes. That's the claim.
And they try to back this up.
Well, the source mentions a White House reporter, doesn't name them, I think, but says this reporter described the whole situation as, quote, a cover-up by any definition.
Covering both public and private interactions, it seems.
That's what the source suggests, yeah.
So, looking at the impact of all this, the source doesn't mince words, does it?
No, not at all. It asserts this whole alleged situation represented a clear and present danger to the entire country.
Okay. That really sets the stakes, at least from this source's perspective.
It certainly does. And from that critique of the administration, the source then pivots pretty hard towards the media.
Right, with a particularly sharp focus on journalist Jake Tapper.
Yes. The source really reacts strongly to a statement Tapper apparently made. He said he owed the American people an acknowledgement for not covering the story better.
But not an apology. I remember seeing that mentioned.
Exactly. And the source just dismisses that distinction, calls it sounding lawyered up.
So what's their interpretation of Tapper's stance?
Well, the source frames it as Tapper essentially admitting he missed the biggest story of the century.
Wow, big claim.
And they say Tapper's defense basically boiled down to being stupid isn't a crime. That's how the source puts it. And the argument the source makes is, what? That Tapper should have known.
Yeah, they argue Tapper knew politicians lie. That's part of the job, they say, but chose to hide Biden's alleged issues anyway.
So it wasn't just missing it, in their view. It was potentially deliberate. That's the accusation. The source insists journalists shouldn't be the last ones to know about something this big. And they argue Tapper should resign, whether he missed it or covered it up.
And this isn't just about Tapper, right? It broadens out.
Oh, definitely. It expands into a wider attack on what the source consistently labels the legacy media. Mainstream news outlets it often criticizes.
And the claim there is
that this legacy media mob, as they call it, actively helped with the alleged cover-up, that they're inherently dishonest. And because of that, they've lost the American people's trust.
So a pretty direct accusation. The media covered up the alleged decline, but then claimed they just didn't notice.
Yeah,
Blamed ignorance.
exactly. Pretended they didn't see it. And then the source adds, almost like rubbing salt in the wound from their perspective,
Yeah.
they claim some in the media are now actually profiting from covering the very story they supposedly missed or hid before.
That's quite the charge.
It is. And what's really striking here is how the source contrasts all this with its own reporting.
Right, they position themselves differently.
Completely. They assert that they were the ones consistently showing the real Biden, including what they describe as his clear and obvious decline.
And that they took heat for it at the time.
Yes, they claim they were criticized for it, essentially framing themselves as having been right all along while everyone else was allegedly covering it up or missing it.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit. How does this source view the Democratic Party itself? Their struggles, their strategy?
Well, they use a pretty vivid analogy to kick things off.
Oh, yeah.
They picture the Democrats like a criminal suspect, someone who confesses to maybe one small crime thinking they're off the hook.
Right.
But the detectives, they say, no, this suspect has a dozen other crimes with their fingerprints all over them, ready to be connected.
Okay, so what's the point of that analogy? What are the other crimes?
It seems to serve as a bridge, connecting the alleged Biden cover-up to a whole list of other issues the source also frames as cover-ups.
Such as?
They list things like the border, Epstein, the lab leak, White House cocaine, the DNC pipe bomb, and the Supreme Court abortion leaks.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is. And their overall framing is that the last 4 years have basically been one big cover-up.
And they mention specific actions being taken.
Yeah, they bring up Representative Comer, the Republican leading investigations, subpoenaing Biden aides, Hunter Biden, and Dr. Jill Biden, presenting that as part of the effort to uncover all these alleged issues.
Interesting. So this leads into how the source interprets the motivation behind all this alleged activity.
Exactly. And here they bring in a quote attributed to the liberal philosopher Sam Harris.
What did he say, according to the source?
The quote they use is something like, "I'd destroy democracy to beat Trump," and preferring a president in a coma, executed by a committee of just normal people, over having Trump back in office.
Okay. And how does the source use that quote?
Well, according to the source, they claim this Sam Harris quote basically confirms their theory.
Which theory?
The theory that Biden wasn't really running the country. They argue it wasn't some wild conspiracy, but the actual deliberate strategy.
A strategy for what?
For having, quote, a brain-dead president with a shadow government run by those unnamed, unelected aides they mentioned earlier.
And they connect this to how Trump was portrayed?
Yes. They argue that calling Trump Hitler, a term they say Democrats used widely, was basically a tactic.
A tactic for what?
To justify beating him by any means necessary.
Huh.
And the source implies this includes things like lying, arresting him, maybe even, they suggest, shooting him.
That's extreme.
It is. The source claims that framing Trump as an existential threat to democracy was the key. It allowed Democrats, in this view, to rationalize anything, including sometimes doing undemocratic things.
Okay. So moving from that alleged strategy to the party's current situation, their messaging, their direction, what's the source's take?
They claim Democrats are just making no sense right now.
No sense. How so?
Well, they highlight a quote from Representative Jasmine Crockett, apparently talking about Trump's mental acuity, and then they immediately juxtapose it with their own criticism of her. Sort of a pot calling the kettle black argument, it seems.
Got it. What else?
They also reference something they describe as either an alleged New York Times report or maybe a Democratic focus group finding. It's a little unclear which.
Okay. And what did this report or finding supposedly say?
It apparently compared Republicans to apex predators.
And Democrats.
To more passive animals, like tortoises, slugs, or sloths.
Seriously?
That's the claim. The source does mention Debbie Dingell commenting on this and clarifies that as they understood it, it was actually voters in the focus group making those comparisons, not the reporter themselves. But the source still uses it.
Uses it how?
To argue that Democrats are basically on a suicide mission just to stop Trump.
A suicide mission? Meaning?
Meaning this relentless focus on Trump, they claim, is costing the party support among key groups, like younger voters and Latinos.
And the risk, according to the source.
They claim the party risks becoming like it was, say, from the 60s to the 90s, only able to win occasional elections, like the one right after Nixon resigned, a kind of long-term minority status.
Do they bring in other voices to back this up?
Yeah, interestingly, they quote Rahm Emanuel, former Chicago mayor, apparently calling the party weak and woke.
Hmm.
And they also mentioned a piece in Politico that supposedly fantasized about a kind of weak left-wing shadow cabinet.
Featuring who?
Figures like Jon Stewart, Giselle Fetterman, Mark Cuban,
Hmm.
people the source presents as evidence of a party that's basically on life support.
Wow. Okay. And what about policy? Does the source criticize their policy stances?
Oh, definitely. They list several areas where they claim Democrats failed to stand up for, let's say, traditional values or common sense, in their view.
Like what?
Things like allowing men to compete in women's sports, failing to stop what they termed the border invasion.
Using some pretty charged language there, I imagine.
It's extremely charged. Terms like unvetted Biden-Harris illegals, terrorists, rapists, murderers, gang members, cartel members. Very strong language.
Okay. What else?
Also, opposing taxpayer funding for sex change operations or for college scholarships for people the source calls illegals. These are the specific examples they raise.
Got it. And there was also something about the economy under Trump mentioned.
Yes. Towards the end of that section, the source includes this depiction of what the economy would look like, hypothetically, under a Trump administration.
And what's that picture?
Claims of a booming economy, the biggest jump ever in consumer confidence, a trade truce with China, gas prices hitting a 4-year low, all supposedly happening within just 4 months of Trump taking office.
So painting a very rosy economic picture as a contrast.
Exactly. A stark contrast to the situation they portray under Biden.
Okay, let's zoom in on one more specific area the source really seems to focus on. That's the Democratic Party and male voters.
Right. There's a very strong claim presented there.
Yeah.
That Democrats are losing men voters en masse, just hemorrhaging support.
And how does the source explain this? What's their take on the party's efforts?
Well, their perspective seems to be that the party's attempts to fix this are clumsy, maybe even disingenuous.
How so?
They specifically mock a reported $20 million American men's study.
A study on American men.
Yeah. And the source portrays this